The Convention of States says we need a convention to propose amendments to limit the size and scope of the federal government. Rubbish. Our Constitution already limits the powers of the federal government to those few and defined powers listed in the Constitution and on the chart. They don't want to limit the size and scope of the federal government. We know this because the amendments they propose add new powers to the federal government or legalize powers the feds have already usurped. Let's look at 3 of their amendments. Michael Ferris, the head of the Convention of States, is pushing a parental rights amendment which he says would protect parental rights. But it does the opposite. It expressly delegates power over children to the federal government. Here is his amendment. See me after. Mark Levin's amendments also do the opposite of what he says. His amendment to limit the federal bureaucracy legalizes what are now unconstitutional federal agencies: education, energy, agriculture, DHS, HUD, HHS, EPA, etc., etc., etc. Our Constitution doesn't authorize these agencies, but Levin's amendment legalizes them. Article 1, Section 1 of our Constitution says only Congress may make laws. But since Woodrow Wilson, federal agencies have been writing rules. This is the abominable code of federal regulations. All these rules are unconstitutional as outside the scope of powers delegated and as in violation of Article 1, Section 1. But Levin's amendment to limit the federal bureaucracy legalizes these rules and rulemaking. Levin's amendment to limit federal spending is also phony. Our Constitution limits federal spending to the enumerated powers. Most of what Congress may lawfully spend money on is listed on the chart. If you go through the Constitution and highlight the powers delegated to Congress and to the President, you will get a complete list of the objects Congress is authorized to spend money on. That is how our framers controlled spending. But Levin's amendment substitutes a budget for the enumerated powers, and while it pretends to limit spending to revenues, it actually permits Congress to suspend the spending limit and continue to raise the national debt. They are deceptive when they say they want amendments to limit the size and scope of the federal government. Their amendments institutionalize the very abuses they purport to correct, nullify the natural rights of the people, and fundamentally change the constitutional design. Even though our Constitution is not being enforced, it still declares this federal government lawless. The true rule of law is still on our side, but not for much longer if we foolishly allow our Constitution to be rewritten. Convention of States says we must amend the Constitution because people in Washington don't understand it. Rubbish. Our Constitution is so simple that Alexander Hamilton said the people are the natural guardians of the Constitution. Federalist Paper number 16, next to the last paragraph. For clauses the Supreme Court perverted: interstate commerce clause, general welfare, and necessary and proper clause. A quick look in the Federalist Paper shows the original intents. We don't need a convention to draft amendments showing what these clauses mean. Look it up in the Federalist But I've already done it. It's all on it's all on this one sheet of paper in large type, the original intent of those 3 clauses, and I proved it, and you can have a copy. Convention of States says we must amend the Constitution to restore powers the feds have taken from the states. Rubbish. The 10th Amendment says all powers not delegated to the federal government by the Constitution are reserved to the states or the people. What happened to those reserved powers? The states sold them to the federal government. God gave parents the duty to educate their children, but state governments ripped this sacred duty from parents and forced their children into government schools and now into federal education schemes such as Common Core. They did it for the federal grant money. DHS is nationalizing local and state law enforcement. DHS answers to Obama. Who issues your driver's licenses? Do you know about the fusion centers in every state? The states acquiesced in this takeover. They did it for the federal funds and the free combat equipment. Why do they want combat equipment? Thanks to state governments, Obama is getting a national police force, the Obama version of the East German Stasi, and we are losing local control of law enforcement. Federal funds make up over 1/3 of the state's annual budgets. The states don't want to rein in the feds. They don't want to lose their federal funding. This session, State Senator May Beavers introduced an Obamacare nullification bill into the Tennessee legislature. But the fiscal note said that if her bill passed, Tennessee would lose $6 billion in federal funds. Well, we can't lose that. So Tennessee is not going to nullify Obamacare. State governments are not victims of federal tyranny. They are collaborators in federal tyranny. For 50 years, progressives have tried to get an Article 5 convention, but we stopped them. So, Convention of States repackaged the push for an Article 5 convention. They now frame it as an issue of states' rights versus the federal government. They falsely portray the states as victims of federal tyranny. And they fabricated the preposterous claim that our framers said the purpose of amendments is to rein in the federal government if it usurps powers. We must distinguish between defects in a constitution and a government's refusal to obey the constitution to which it is subject. There were defects in our constitution. Slavery. Amendments fix defects, but our problem is a disobedient federal and state governments. That calls for different remedies, and our framers spelled them out. Resistance, nullification. Our framers never said that the purpose of amendments is to rein in the feds if they usurp powers. One delegate at the Federal Convention of 1787, George Mason, said something along those lines, but he was in the minority. He didn't get his way, and he refused to sign the Constitution. Mason objected to Congress controlling the amendment process. On the last day of deliberations, the convention method of proposing amendments was added, but since Congress calls the convention, Congress still controls both methods, as the CRS report confirms. And Mason refused to sign the Constitution. What our framers, those who signed the Constitution, actually said is that amendments remedy defects in the Constitution, that amendment of errors and useful alterations would be suggested by experience, that the novelty and difficulty of what they were doing would require periodic revision, that useful amendments would address the organization of the government, not the mass of its powers. Now, think about the silliness of the claim that the purpose of amendments is to control the feds. Consider federal gun control laws, background checks, BATF rules, outlawing of shotguns shorter than 18 inches. Where does our Constitution delegate to the federal government power to restrict our arms? It doesn't. They do it anyway. So, if we get an amendment saying that the federal government can't infringe our right to keep and bear arms, will that rein in the feds?